Hey, Jerica. Good evening.
Hi, good evening. How
Great to
are
be with
you?
you on Justice Now.
Yes, we are so excited, and I want to say thank you to all of our viewers who tuned in last week. We appreciate your patience, but we had to hit January. We had to hit the ground running in January and really wanted to be on with our president and CEO, Mark Morial. So I just want to say welcome. Good evening to everyone. Thank you for joining us for tonight's Justice Now conversation, sponsored by the National Urban League. I am your host, Jerica Richardson, and I serve as a Senior Vice President for Equitable Justice and Strategic Initiatives at the League. And, tonight's episode is a really important one and very special. Last week, we celebrated the national holiday and the birthday and really the accomplishments of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a civil rights icon and hero to so many Americans. So I couldn't think of a better way to, have this conversation in January than to remember Dr. King, his legacy, and discuss the path forward in today's civil rights movement, especially as it pertains to voting rights, than with our fearless leader at the National Urban League, a civil rights champion, a former mayor, and leader in his own right, and my boss, as all of you have tuned in, the Honorable NUL President and CEO. There are just so many titles. We need to get them all in here. President Mark H. Morial. Mark, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, Jerica, let me first of all say thank you to you. You have now led our equitable justice work now for about 18 months. And it has been an incredible journey as we've lifted the voice and the role of the Urban League movement on issues related to justice, civic engagement, the 2020 election, the discussion around police reform, police reimagination, a smarter approach to public safety, the work we did on the census, combating all of the political interference that occurred in connection with the census. Your leadership has been outstanding. You and your team have brought something long needed to the National Urban League. So I want to thank you. And obviously, it is a great opportunity for me to be with you tonight. As we, in January, always honor Martin Luther King. And we also prepare in January for February, which is always an important month, the month that we celebrate Black history and Black History Month. So I'm just glad to be here with you. I want to thank everybody for joining and those that will watch us after the fact as well.
Thank you for that, Mark. I will say both from the Equitable Justice and Strategic Initiatives team and myself, that it really is an honor to serve and be part of the movement at this time. You lifted up two things there. We're talking about Dr. King and his legacy and his work. But we are also knowing that we're looking ahead to February and Black History Month. And you and I both know that Black history is 365 days of the year. But, we definitely want to take the moment to talk about the work because we know it continues. Mark, if you'll allow me, I would like to step back and kind of set the stage and give a little context to this discussion.
Mm-hmm.
You lead one of the one of the largest, well, the largest and one of the oldest civil rights organizations of our time. And we know there are 91 affiliates across the country, and we've been doing the work. But I think it would be helpful for our viewers for you to talk a little bit about why this fight in civil rights, why it's necessary, why it just didn't just die in the 1960s. It's something that we continue on and that we continue to lift up in keeping in mind the legacy of Dr. King. Folks talk about what he did in the South, but Dr. King, like the National Urban League, went north because we recognize that discrimination didn't just live in the South. And the Urban League, now when we think about it, has affiliates in suburban, rural, and urban cities all across this country. Can you talk a little bit about what the civil rights fight looks like for us in today's times?
So history, good question. History has taught us that after we win or we gain a step, we have to fight to maintain it. And we're witnessing before our very eyes in the times in which we live, here in the 21st century, an unbridled, carefully orchestrated attack on many of the gains that were made in the last 60 years. First, there's the attack on voting rights. What does that mean, an attack on voting rights? Well, it simply means that, once again, states' rights, states are using their legislative power. Republican-led states are using their legislative power to make it harder for people to cast a ballot. What does that mean, make it harder? Did you vote by mail? Did you early vote in 2020? Did you absentee vote or drop your ballot in a drop box? Well, there are states now that are seeking to eliminate that as an option to vote. And what they are saying is, wow, vote by mail, drop boxes, absentee was a method used by many Americans, but also used by Black Americans, used by poor Americans, used by brown Americans, used by disabled Americans, used by young Americans, because it made it more convenient for people who work and sometimes have difficulty getting transportation to be able to cast their ballot. So this targeted effort is motivated, directed at voters who are Black, who are brown, who are young, who are indigenous, who are disabled across the land. So there have been hundreds, that's right, hundreds of bills introduced since January of 2021 in some 40 plus states. I think approximately 19 states may have actually passed some form of restrictive laws. That's what's going on, people. A blockade around the ballot box, affecting our freedom to vote, our freedom to vote, our right as an American citizen to be able to vote in elections. And it was unimaginable 20 years ago when many believed, and I remember the discussions and I remember the conversations. We've solved the problem of voting rights. We have the Voting Rights Act.
1965.
We've
Let's put the
solved
markers
it. The
down.
law is on the books. It's been renewed. It's been upheld.
Bipartisan.
Yet now,
right?
in 2020, in the 21st century, the Supreme Court, in two decisions by judicial fiat, struck down parts of the Voting Rights Act that had been upheld for many, many years. So we are facing this need for you and I and those of us of this generation to stand up once again, to battle and to work and to fight to protect the freedom to vote, access to the ballot box. It is troubling, and I get worked up when I think about it, that the Roberts Supreme Court in 2013 punched a big hole in the Voting Rights Act for no reason, in a decision which was poorly reasoned, historically inaccurate, and what I call cleverly illogical. Because when you read it, it sounds logical. Oh, we've done this, we've done that. You know, voter turnout is now equal. It's not equal. We have had a couple of presidential elections where it's close to equal, but it's not equal. Gubernatorial, state, legislative.
And racism hasn't
You know, the
died.
presidential
We're
race
still
is
different.
one election out of many. It's one person we vote for. It's of paramount importance of all of the. We vote for mayors and city council members and clerks of court, many states judges, state legislators, state senators, members of Congress, members of the Senate. we still have great disparities in voting patterns in this country. So I just feel that, you know, you and I, the National Urban League, so we focus on civil rights and economic empowerment. And one of our sweet spots is economic empowerment.
Mm-hmm.
But we do not have a voice on economic policy if we can't vote people into office that share our concerns, our views, and our aspirations.
Mark.
So we have to be an advocate for voting rights if we are about educational equity, if we're about economic equity, if we're about fair housing. It compels us to understand that voting and democracy is the gateway to having a seat at the table.
Absolutely. Mark, there is one thing that you lifted up there that really resonates with me and reminds me of a quote that we have from Dr. King. I'm going to share it with everyone right now. It's from his book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? And it was published in 1968, but I think it is still relevant today. Dr. King said, and so we must do more than register and more than vote. We have to create leaders that embody virtues that we respect, who have moral and ethical principles that we can applaud with an enthusiasm that enables us to rally support for them based on confidence and trust. And I lift that up because I think what we see ourselves in is there's a crisis in confidence. And so, Mark, you know, for those folks that are disappointed about what we saw last week in the Senate, and I'm sure you'll talk a little bit more about that and what that means for us. What can folks do? Because they feel like they showed up to the polls.
But it's important in all of these conversations
Mm-hmm.
for smart people, thinking people, thoughtful people, civically engaged people to think beyond the headline.
Right.
So the headline is voting rights didn't pass. The truth is there were 48 members of 100 of the United States Senate who were willing to take the extraordinary step to set aside the filibuster to pass freedom to vote, voting rights legislation. 52 were not willing to take the step. So clearly, public opinion, or even opinion in the Congress, is divided. Then number two, according to all of the best surveys and public opinion polls, 60% plus of all of us who vote in this country support the provisions of these voting rights bills. 60+%. So what I hope people will take away is we have some leaders who are not in touch. Some. We have some leaders who are very passionate and feel the way we feel. So we can't throw the proverbial baby out with the bathwater here. We have to continue to be. So I spent 24 hours being more than disappointed,
Mm-hmm.
feeling in a way that only the choicest words that are not fit to publish could describe. And then after 24 hours, I remembered what my father would tell me continuously and constantly, which is don't get mad, don't get even, get ahead.
Mm.
Focus on the continuing fight, the continuing battle. And this is where we are today. We have to focus on, so the American people, we have to continue to educate them on what voter suppression means, who's carrying it out, what their motivation is. We have to educate the American people on what leaders can and should do to push back on it, what courts can and should do. And what I believe we need is a new movement in this country. We have to push back on this very dark, this very hate-filled movement that saw as one of its gestations the actions on January 6th.
Mm.
Now you hear former Republican leaders talking about jailing members of the congressional committee who are investigating. What kind of talk is that? Is this North Korea? Is this a despotic country where we use the power we have to shut down people who are engaging in a lawful, constitutionally constituted process? It was one of the most offensive, inane things I had heard, but it is a reflection of how coarse this conversation has become in this country. We have to keep the faith. We have to keep the focus. We have to continue to do our work. We have to continue to push for the protection of democracy and the right to vote. This issue of democracy is a big issue here at home. It's a big issue abroad. You see Putin saber rattling on the border of Ukraine, an independent republic. You see leaders in places like Hungary and the Philippines engage in Trumpist rhetoric. But I still believe, for all of its flaws, that representative democracy is the best political system. For all of its flaws, that it is better than the others, which are totalitarian, despotic, and which do not meaningfully give people a right or a say, because they have a lot of show elections, uncontested races, and the like. So we have to continue to lift up democracy and fight, Jerica. We have to fight cynicism. Yeah. It doesn't matter. You're gonna surrender the power to everyone else when you say that. You're gonna say, come on, take advantage of me. It doesn't matter. And I know that some people feel this way, but we have to convince, cajole, and work so that people understand that we have to continue to participate in this democratic system.
Mark, I wholeheartedly agree. The world is watching, right? We say that we are founded, we are a democracy, but we have to do all that we can to protect the vote in order to actually live up to that. I think one of the things that it's important for us to focus on is, yes, we are fighting on the national level and we have not given up the fight, but we also see that the battle is being waged on the state and local level. And in this movement, I know we are dedicated under your leadership to creating a culture of civic engagement. And Mark, can you talk a little bit more about what that means exactly? Because a lot of folks feel like they focus on the national elections and come out every 4 years and say they did their job.
And I will tell people, I served in state and local government, and the infinite power that state and local government has. Concerned about your water bill, concerned about whether housing is affordable in your community or neighborhood, concerned about public safety, gun violence, and policing, concerned about the condition of parks, schools, and playgrounds in your neighborhood. All of those are issues significantly controlled and impacted by local government, by state governments, by municipal governments, by county governments, by school districts, transit authorities. So we part of what we have to do is educate ourselves about this thing called power. Mm-hmm. Not because we want to be drunk on power, but because we have to understand the levers that impact the very way in which we live, the way in which we work, and the way in which we play. So I say to people, it's disappointing now, Jerica, that mayoral elections in Boston, New York, Atlanta, New Orleans, those that I'm familiar with in the last year, yielded low voter turnout in the 20%, maybe even up to 30% rate. That's not acceptable. When I ran for office, mayor, I had a 70% turnout. 70%. We had to, now, well, how do you explain it? It's hard to explain, but it's a challenge to candidates. When voters don't vote, they're sending a message about the system. They're sending you a message about the candidates. We've got to work to fight against that. We cannot vote by not voting. Vote by checking out and saying, everyone else, you all make the choices, and I'm going to sit over here and just be mad.
Yeah.
Right? Or I'm going to sit over here and say, I'll protest. We have to recognize that protest politics, electoral politics go hand in hand. That a civically engaged citizen is going to vote, but they're also going to weigh in with their voice. They're going to weigh in on social media. They're going to weigh in at public meetings. They're going to weigh in on the issues that they're concerned about.
We need to make sure all of our voters, everyone that's registered, really see their responsibility and advocacy too. Because it does start with the protest. It starts with showing up at the ballot box. But we have to stay on our elected officials and make sure that they recognize that we will hold them accountable if they don't follow through on their promises. You know, I think sometimes that's where the frustration is, but we do have a responsibility to stay on top of them, to stay on the issues, and that we need to move from just voting, but actually being advocates on the policy front.
Yes, and let me say this. Social media is a very important tool, but social media is not enough. I know we've been in COVID. It's harder to show up at meetings. It's harder to be engaged, but we have got to be engaged. And I'm appealing to this generation that marched in the streets, that built a new movement in this country, that shook the foundation and said, pay attention to the issue of equal justice under law, pay attention to structural racism and discrimination. For that generation to not get weary, not get tired, not think that a movement of a year is enough, but for them to emerge as voices and leaders in this new generation, in this new era.
I love that you said that, because we've seen it today. If we even think about, you know, most recently in the marches that have been had, we see that civil rights is really on a continuum. You have 13-year-old Yolanda Renee King is still calling for civil rights and access to the ballot box and fighting for voting rights in the same way that her grandfather did before. So we all have a responsibility.
She's a beautiful, powerful young activist. I love the way that she is positioned herself, and our parents have been so supportive of her. And look, we need to encourage more young people to be activists and voices in this battle and in this fight. And I want everyone to realize, when those young people in your family make 18, get them registered. Get them registered. Make sure they're registered. Make sure they are voting. And then we have to talk about politics, talk about issues, talk about racial justice. We have to talk about these issues. You know, I had a conversation with a young man, happened to be a brother, on critical race theory. He said to me, I'm not for critical race theory. I asked him, I said, what does it mean to you? What does the term mean? He said, you know, that's the problem. I don't know what it means. So then I sort of gave him some examples and explained some things to him. He said, well, yeah, I'm for that. He said, is that what it's called? So sometimes we have to understand this terminology. We have to break it down. We have to talk to people what structural discrimination is. We have to offer them the example of redlining, when Black people could not buy homes because the government would not guarantee loans in the neighborhoods in which they lived. A perfect example of institutional racism, perfect example of how for years and years and years, black people couldn't buy a house, therefore they didn't accumulate any wealth. They're just paying rent, not paying and building equity. So there are so many of these important elements and dynamics that we have to educate each other and spend time talking to each other so we understand these issues in the broadest context, but also understand how through the process of whether it's protests, advocacy, or voting, those issues can be impacted.
Yes, I mean, we have our homework. Really, our responsibility is to educate. And Mark, I just thank you for all the education that you have shared with us during this conversation. And I know more that will be coming. We're going to be talking about reclaiming our vote. You know, we did it.
Reclaim our vote.
Yes.
Our civic engagement work this year, we're going to re-elevate it. And Jerica, I look forward to your leadership and our collaboration on this. So, look, I appreciate the leadership and the work you do. I want to thank everyone who's joined tonight and really encourage people to be a part of the ongoing conversation. The National Urban League has our Justice Now IG series. We've got our State of Black America podcast. We've got weekly remarks newsletter. We're active at Nat Urban League on social media. I'm active at Mark Boreal on social media. Be part of our conversation on an ongoing basis.
There's so many ways for folks to plug in and engage. And we just encourage you to stay active and be part of the movement. Clearly, Mark lifted up all the different platforms that we're on, but know that having these platforms and having these conversations, you know, we're reading the comments, we're hearing from you. You are also informing our work. And so everyone's voice in this matters. And we really have to continue to keep up the fight and to stay faithful and hopeful. And we just can't give in. You know, it's the minute we stop fighting that we're in trouble. And
Never
so,
quit.
Mark, I'm just going to give you the final word for everyone.
I just want to say thank you to everyone for joining. Let's continue this fight in this month of January. Let's honor Dr. King, but we can't celebrate until Congress passes this voting rights legislation. Make no mistake about it. What happened last week was a setback, but not a defeat. We forge ahead, we go on.
Thank you, Mark. And thank you to all of the folks who have joined in to hear from us today. We look forward to having more conversations like this. And remember, stay in touch with the Urban League on your local level, but also on the national level. We have so much work to do. Remember, the time for justice is always now. Thank you all. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Jerica.
Bye.